So, and however the people who wrote these stories thought was more like dramatists think, more like Shakespeare thought. But that doesn't mean that there isn't truth in it. It just means that you have to be a little bit more sophisticated about your ideas of truth. And that's okay, you know. There are truths to live by. Okay, well, fine. Then we want to figure out what those are because we need to live and maybe not to suffer so much. So if you know that what the Bible stories and stories in general are trying to represent is the lived experience of conscious individuals, like the structure of the lived experience of conscious individuals, then that opens up the possibility of a whole different realm of understanding and eliminates the contradiction that's been painful for people between the objective world and let's say the claims of religious stories. So, okay, so let's take a look at the structure of the book itself. So the first thing about the Bible is that it's a comedy. And a comedy has a happy ending, right? So that's a strange thing because the Greek God stories were almost always tragic. Now, the Bible is a comedy. It has a happy ending. Everyone lives. There's a heaven. So, now, what you think about that is a completely different issue. I'm just telling you the structure of the story. It's something like there was paradise at the beginning of time, and then some cataclysm occurred and people fell into history, and history is limitation and mortality and suffering and self-consciousness. But there's a mode of being, or potentially the establishment of a state, that will transcend that. And that's what time is aiming at. So that's the idea of the story. Now, it's a funny thing that the Bible has a story because it wasn't written as a book, right? It was assembled from a whole bunch of different books. And the fact that it got assembled into something resembling a story is quite remarkable. And what the question is then, well, what is that story about? And how did it come up as a story? And then I suppose as well, is there anything to it? It constitutes a dramatic record of self-realization or abstraction. We already mentioned that. It's like the idea, for example, of the formulation of the, let's say, the image of God is an abstraction. That's how we're going to handle it to begin with. I want to say, though, because I said I wasn't going to be any more reductionist than necessary, I know that the evidence for genuine religious experience is incontrovertible, but it's not explicable. And so I don't want to explain it away. I want to just leave it as a fact. And then I want to pull back from that and say, okay, well, we'll leave that as a fact and a mystery, but we'll look at this, we're going to look at this from a rational perspective and say that the initial formulation of the idea of God was an attempt to abstract out the ideal and to consider it as an abstraction outside its instantiation. So, and that's good enough. That's an amazing thing if it's true. But I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, let's say. It's a collection of books with multiple redactors and editors. So what does that mean? Many people wrote it. There's many different books, and they're interwoven together, especially in the first 5 books, by people who, I suspect, took the traditions of tribes that had been brought together under a single political organization and tried to make their accounts coherent. And so they took a little of this, and they took a little of that, and they took a little of this, and they tried not to lose anything because it seemed valuable, or it was certainly valuable to the people who had collected the stories. They weren't going to, tolerate too much editing, but they also wanted it to make sense to some degree, so it wasn't completely logically contradictory and completely absurd. And so many people wrote it, and many people edited it, and many people assembled it over a vast stretch of time. And we have very few documents like that. And so just because we have a document like that is sufficient reason to look at it as a remarkable phenomena and try to understand what it is that it's trying to communicate, let's say. And then I said it's also the world's first hyperlinked text, which is that again, and very much worth thinking about for quite a long time. All right, there's 4 sources in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. 4 stories that we know came together. One was called the priestly. There's a source called the priestly, and it used the name Elohim or El Shaddai for God. And I believe El is the root word for Ella as well. So, and that's usually translated as God or the gods, because Elohim is utilized as plural in the beginning books of the Bible. And it's newer than the Yahwist version. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is because Genesis 1, which is the first story, isn't as old as Genesis 2. Genesis 2 contains, the Yahwist version contains the story, for example, of Adam and Eve. And that's older than the very first book in the Bible. But they decided to put the newer version first, and well, it isn't, and I think it's because it deals with more fundamental abstractions. It's something like that. It's like it deals with the most basic of abstractions, how the universe was created, and then segues into what the human environment is like. And so that seems to be the logic behind it. The Yahwist version uses the name YHWH, which apparently people didn't say, but we believe was pronounced something like Yahweh. And it has a strongly anthropomorphic God, so one that takes human form. It begins with Genesis 2:4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when, and it contains the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah and the Tower of Babel and Exodus and Numbers, along with the priestly version. It also contains the law in the form, just the form of the Ten Commandments, which is like a truncated form of the law. There's the Elohist source. It contains the stories of Abraham and Isaac. It's concerned with a heavenly hierarchy that includes angels. It talks about the departure from Egypt, and it presents the covenant code, which is this idea of that, that society is predicated. This was Israeli society. It was predicated on a covenant with God, and that's laid out in a sequence of rules, some of which are the Ten Commandments, but many of which are much more extensive than that. And then the final one is the Deuteronomist code, and it contains the bulk of the law and what's called the Deuteronomic history, and it's independent of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And so we know that at least now there's debate about this like there is about everything, so I'm brushing over a very large area of scholarship, but people generally assume that there were multiple authors over multiple periods of time, and the way they've concluded that is by looking at textual analysis, trying to see where there are chunks of the stories that have the same kind of style or the same reference. And people argue about that because, obviously it's difficult to recreate something ancient, but that's the basic idea. So it is an amalgam of viewpoints about these initial issues, and that's important to know. So it's like it's a collective story. And, okay, now, to understand the first part of Genesis, I'm going to turn, strangely enough, to something that's actually part of the New Testament, and this is a central element of Christianity. And it's a very strange idea, and it's going to take a very long time to unpack, but the idea, this is what John said about Christ. He said, in the beginning was the Word, and so that relates back to Genesis 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Three sentences like that take a lot of unpacking because, well, none of that seems to make any sense whatsoever, really, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was both with God, and the Word was God. So the first question might be, what in the world does that mean? In the beginning was the Word. That's the Logos, actually. And the Logos is embodied in the figure of Christ. So there's this idea in John that whatever Christ is, the Son of God, is not only instantiated in history, say at a particular time and place as a carpenter in some backwoods part of the world, but also something eternal that exists outside of time and space that was there right at the beginning. And as far as I can tell, what that Logos represents is something like modern people, it's something like what modern people refer to when they talk about consciousness. It's something like that. It's more than that. It's like consciousness and its capacity to be aware and its capacity to communicate. It's something like that, and there's an idea underneath that, which is that being, especially from a phenomenological perspective, so the being that is experience cannot exist without consciousness. It's like consciousness shines a light on things to bring it into being. Because without consciousness, what is there? No one experiences anything. It's like, is there anything when no one experiences anything? That's the question, and the answer that this book is presenting is that, no, you have to think about consciousness as a constituent element of reality. It's something that's necessary for reality itself to exist. Now, of course, it depends on what you mean by reality. But the reality that's being referred to here, I told you already, is this strange amalgam of the subjective experience and the world. But the question is deeper than that too, because it is by no means obvious what there is if there's no one to experience it. I mean, the whole notion of time itself seems to collapse, at least in terms of something like felt duration. And then the notion of size disappears essentially because there's nothing to scale it, and the causality seems to vanish. And so, and we don't understand consciousness, not in the least. We don't understand what it is that is in us that gives illumination to being. And what happens in the Old Testament, at least in part, is that that consciousness is associated with the divine. Now you think, well, is that a reasonable proposition? And that's a very complicated question, but at least we might note that there's something to the claim, because there is a miracle of experience and existence that's dependent on consciousness. I mean, people try to explain it away constantly, but it doesn't seem to work very well. And here's something else to think about, I think, that's really worth thinking about. People do not like it when you treat them like they're not conscious, right? They react very badly to that. And then you don't like it if someone assumes that you're not conscious, and you don't like it if someone assumes that you don't have free will, you know, that you're just absolutely determined in your actions, and there's nothing that's going to repair you, and that you don't need to have any responsibility for your actions. It's like our culture, the laws of our culture are predicated on the idea, something like people are conscious, people have experience, people make decisions and can be held responsible for them, that there's a free will element to it. And you can debate all that philosophically, and fine, but the point is that that is how we act, and that is the idea that our legal system is predicated on. And there's something deep about it, because, you know, you're subject to the law, but the law is also limited by you, which is to say that in a well-functioning, properly grounded democratic system, you have intrinsic value. That's the source of your rights. Even if you're a murderer, we have to say the law can only go so far because there's something about you that's divine. Well, what does that mean? Well, partly it means that there's something about you that's conscious and capable of communicating, like you're a whole world unto yourself. And you have that to contribute to everyone else, and that's valuable. I mean, that you can learn new things, you can transform the structure of society, you can invent a new way of dealing with the world. You're capable of all that. It's an intrinsic part of you, and that's associated with this. It's associated, that's the idea there, is that there's something about the logos that is necessary for the absolute chaos of the reality beyond experience to manifest itself as reality. It's an amazing idea because it gives consciousness a constitutive role in the cosmos. And you can debate that, but you know, it's not, you can't just bloody well brush it off. Because first of all, we are the most complicated things there are that we know of by a massive amount. We're so complicated that it's unbelievable. And so, you know, there's a lot of cosmos out there, but there's a lot of cosmos in here too. And which one is greater is by no means obvious unless you use something trivial like relative size, which, you know, really isn't a very sophisticated approach. And whatever it is that is you has this capacity to experience reality and to transform it, which is a very strange thing, you know. You can conceptualize a future in your imagination, and then you can work and make that manifest. You participate in the process of creation. That's one way of thinking about it. And so that's why I think in Genesis 1, it relates the idea that human beings are made in the image of the divine, men and women, which is interesting too, because, you know, the feminists are always criticizing Christianity, for example, as being, inexorably patriarchal. Of course, they criticize everything like that, so it's hardly a stroke of bloody brilliance. But I think it's an absolute miracle that right at the beginning of the document, it says straightforwardly, like with no hesitation whatsoever, that the divine spark, which we're associating with the word that brings forth being, is manifest in men and women equally. That's a very cool thing. And you got to think, well, like I said, do you actually take that seriously? Well, what you got to ask is, what happens if you don't take it seriously? Right? Read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. That's the best investigation of that tactic that's ever been produced. Because what happens in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is that the main character, whose name is Raskolnikov, decides that there's no intrinsic value to other people. And that as a consequence, he can do whatever he wants. It's only cowardice that stops him from acting, right? Because why would it be anything else if the value of other people is just an arbitrary superstition? Then why can't I do exactly what I want when I want? Which is the psychopath's viewpoint. Well, so Raskolnikov does. He kills someone who's a very horrible person, and he has very good reasons for killing her. And he's half starved and a little bit insane and possessed by this ideology. It's brilliant, brilliant layout. And he finds out something after he kills her, which is that the post-killing Raskolnikov and the pre-killing Raskolnikov are not the same person even a little bit. Because he's broken a rule, like he's broken a serious rule, and there's no going back. And Crime and Punishment is the best investigation I know of what happens if you take the notion that there's nothing divine about the individual seriously. Now, you know, most of the people I know who are deeply atheistic, and I understand why they're deeply atheistic, they haven't contended with people like Dostoevsky, not as far as I can tell. Because I don't see logical flaws in Crime and Punishment. I think he got the psychology exactly right. And Dostoevsky's amazing for this, because in one of his books, The Devils, for example, he describes a political scenario that's not much different than the one we find ourselves in now. And there are these people who are possessed by rationalistic, utopian, atheistic ideas. And they're very powerful. They give rise to the communist revolution, right? I mean, they're powerful ideas. And his character, Stavrogan, also acts out the presupposition that human beings have no intrinsic nature and no intrinsic value. And it's another brilliant investigation, and Dostoevsky prophesies, that's what I would say, what will happen to a society if it goes down that road? And he was dead exactly accurate. It's uncanny to read Dostoevsky's The Possessed, or The Devils, depending on the translation, and then to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. Because one is fiction and prophecy, and the second is, hey, look, it turned out exactly the way that Dostoevsky said it would for exactly the same reasons. So it's quite remarkable. So the question is, do you contend seriously with the idea that A, there's something cosmically constitutive about consciousness, and B, that might well be considered divine, and C, that is instantiated in every person? And then ask yourself if you're not a criminal if you don't act it out. And then ask yourself what that means. Is that reflective of a reality? You know, is it a metaphor? Like maybe it's a metaphor, a complex metaphor that we have to use to organize our societies. Could well be, but even as a metaphor, it's true enough so that we mess with it at our peril. And it also took people a very long time to figure out. This is Genesis 1. You know, and I'm probably going to stop there because I believe it's 9:30. And so we didn't even get to the first line. Yeah. Look, I want to read you a couple of things that we'll use as a prodroma for the next lecture, because I'll just bounce through a collection of ideas that's associated with the notion of divinity, okay? And then we'll turn back to the first lines when we start the next lecture. I have no idea how far I'm going to get through the biblical stories, by the way, because I'm trying to figure this out as I go along. Okay, so, you know, there's an idea in Christianity that the image of God is a Trinity, right? There's the Father, there's the element of the Father, there's the element of the Son, and there's the element of the Holy Spirit. And it's something like tradition, the spirit of tradition. It's something like the human being as the newest incarnation of that tradition, like the living incarnation of that tradition. And then it's something like the spirit in people that makes relationship with this and this possible, the spirit in individuals. And so I'm going to bounce my way quickly through some of the classical metaphorical attributes of God, so that we kind of have a cloud of notions about what we're talking about when we return to Genesis 1 and talk about the God who spoke chaos into being. So there's a fatherly aspect. So here's what God as a father is like. You can enter into a covenant with it, so you can make a bargain with it. Now you think about that, money is like that. Because money is a bargain you make with the future, right? And so we've structured our world so that you can negotiate with the future. And I don't think that we would have got to the point where we could do that without having this idea to begin with. You can act as if the future is a reality. There's a spirit of tradition that enables you to act as if the future is something that can be bargained with. That's why you make sacrifices, right? And the sacrifices were acted out for a very long period of time, and now they're psychological. We know that you can sacrifice something valuable in the present and expect that you're negotiating with something that represents the transcendent future. And that's an amazing human discovery. Like no other creature can do that, to act as if the future is real. To note that you can bargain with reality itself and that you can do it successfully. It's unbelievable. It responds to sacrifice. It answers prayers. I'm not saying that any of this is true, by the way. I'm just saying what the cloud of ideas represents. It punishes and rewards. It judges and forgives. It's not nature. You see, one of the things that's weird about the Judeo-Christian tradition is that God and nature are not the same thing at all. Whatever God is, partially manifest in this logos, is something that stands outside of nature. And I think that's something like consciousness as abstracted from the natural world. So it built Eden for mankind and then banished us for disobedience. It's too powerful to be touched. It granted free will. Distance from it is hell. Distance from it is death. It reveals itself in dogma and in mystical experience, and it's the law. So that's sort of like the fatherly aspect. And then the son-like aspect, it speaks chaos into order. It slays dragons and feeds people with the remains. It finds gold. It rescues virgins. It's the body and blood of Christ. It's a tragic victim and scapegoat and eternally triumphant redeemer simultaneously. It cares for the outcast. It dies and is reborn. It's the king of kings and hero of heroes. It's not the state, but is both the fulfillment and critic of the state. It dwells in the perfect house. It is aiming at paradise or heaven. It can rescue from hell. It cares for the outcast. It's the foundation stone and the cornerstone that was rejected, and it's the spirit of the law. And then it's spirit-like. It's akin to the human soul. It's the prophetic voice. It's the still small voice of conscience. It's the spoken truth. It's called forth by music. It is the enemy of deceit, arrogance, and resentment. It's the water of life. It burns without consuming, and it's a blinding light. Okay, so that's a very well-developed set of poetic metaphors, essentially, right? So these are all, what would you say, glimpses of the transcendent ideal. That's the right way of thinking about it. They're glimpses of the transcendent ideal. And all of them have a specific meaning. And, well, in part what we're going to do is go over that meaning as we continue with this series. And so what we've got now is a brief description, at least, of what this is. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We know it's associated with the logos in this sequence of stories. We know it's associated with the word and with consciousness, and we know that it's associated with whatever God is. And then I laid out the metaphoric landscape that at least in part describes God, and so now we have some sense of the being that does this, creates the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. That's that chaotic state of intermingled confusion. And darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And so we'll stop with that, because now we're ready to take a tentative step into the very first part of this book. And it's important to have your conceptual framework properly organized so that you can appreciate where it's going and what it might possibly mean. And so, well, I've done what I can today to, what would you say, elaborate on this single word, I suppose. And but it's a big word, you know, so it's not so unreasonable that it takes a long time to get to the point where you have any sense of what it means at all. All right. That is nowhere near, that is not, I thought I would get a lot farther than that. All right. So thank you very much. So we do have time for some questions. We have to be out of here at 10:30. It's 9:30, so maybe we'll have questions until someone crazy grabs the microphone. And or maybe we'll have questions for half an hour, something like that. And so if anybody has any questions, then there's a microphone there, and there's a microphone there. And I'll try to answer them to the best that I can, best of my ability. So let's start.
Okay, so you talked about the idea of when you're confronting something that you fear, you face it head on and you destroy it. But then you said that the idea is when you're confronting something, you make the world out of it. And I was wondering if you could just, generally expound on what that means.
You make your marriage out of the arguments.
Okay.
You know, you have arguments with your wife, you have arguments with your children. That's that chaotic state, because no one's been able to formulate a habitable order from that domain of controversy and confusion. And then through dialogue, you erect a structure that's a house that you can both live in. And so that's the idea of making the world out of that chaos. And it's frightening because, you know, if you really and this is why people often avoid having disputes with people they love, because it's frightening, right? You find out what the person's like and you find out what you're like. It's like, God, who wants to do that? Nobody. And so, you know, your heart rate goes up, and it's confrontation and conflict. And that's because you're encountering that domain that hasn't been properly mapped or configured. And you're doing that with your predator detection systems, essentially. And so that chaos that threatens the stability, say, of the marriage is equivalent to, well, it's equivalent to the serpent in the tree. That's one form of equivalence. And then by dialogue, through dialogue and negotiation, you formulate the problem. What exactly is going on here? Where exactly are we? What exactly is the problem? And so you keep talking until you reach a consensus about that, one that you can live with, one that you can act out, right? And then maybe you come up with a solution to the problem, and you've established peace again. And peace, that's the house that you can both live in. And that's the chaos. That's the chaos that people can fall into all the time and often do. And it's the chaos that makes a marriage wash up on the shores and transform into, like, you know, 15-year divorce court. Very horrible thing. So that's the idea.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. Thank you so much for the talk, and thanks for your teachings. It's really helped me a lot. I had an experience in grad school, 2 English degrees, and the way you described the humanities in my experience helped me understand my experience back then. So thank you. So
That's too bad. That's too bad that happens to be the case. Really, like that, you know, it's really not good. But
you don't have to tell me that.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but, you know, I survived, and I learned a lot. And, you know, I'm not, you know, ungrateful for my experience. I've learned a lot. But you said something, you described the Bible, the collection of stories in the Bible, in an interesting way, and I wonder if it was on purpose. You described it as created by an assembly of stories created by many people over time that's hyperlinked into itself. And it sounds a lot like how a description of like the internet and like how that works.
Yeah, well, it's not accidental. I mean, because the internet's also a collective endeavor. God only knows what personality it's going to manifest, you know, but it's going to manifest some personality because it's learning to understand us very, very rapidly. So I think there's no reason not to think about it as a precursor. I mean, the distance between the Bible and the internet is a lot less than the distance between a chimpanzee and a human being. So, you know, and the difference between a book and the internet is, it's in some sense, it's a matter of degree rather than kind. So
if the internet is going to, you know, manifest a personality one day, and then that personality gets embodied, what would separate? It sounds like you're talking about consciousness.
I can't speculate, you know, because God only knows what's going to happen in the next 20 years. I certainly don't. And so I don't know what the preconditions are for consciousness. I have no idea, and I don't think anybody knows. So I guess we're going to find out. So, yep. Yep.
Hey, Dr. Peterson. I'm curious about the connection between aesthetic beauty and religious experience. I think you've hinted at it once or twice over the course of this lecture. Is it possible for something that's incredibly beautiful to evoke a religious or mystical experience, or something kind of in the same ballpark?
I think that's what they're for.
Yeah,
in some
actually,
sense, I mean, if you look at the structure of like a Renaissance cathedral, there's
that's
just
literally what I was just gonna. That was
right.
That was my tag on. I apologize, I didn't mean to interrupt. My tag on to that question. The next part was, is that why we have cathedrals built like as spectacular buildings as opposed to a little box or something?
Right. Well, if you're going to house the ultimate ideal, you build something beautiful, right? To represent its dwelling place, and it should be beautiful. And this is something that people do not take seriously. And this is especially something we don't take seriously in Canada. I mean, you think about all the hundreds of millions of dollars that were invested into beauty in Europe. I mean, spectacular, excessive investment in beauty that's paid back. God only knows how many multiples of times. People make pilgrimages to Europe constantly because it's so beautiful that it staggers you. Beauty is so valuable, and we're so afraid of it. And I think we're afraid of it because it's a pathway. It's not the only pathway to the divine. I mean, there's pathways to the divine. Love is one of them, I suppose. But beauty, especially for people who have an affinity for beauty, it's like music. It's one of those things that you can't argue against, right? You can't even understand. It just hits you. And it shows you the ideal. That's one way of thinking about it. But it also shows you, I think, it's like a vision of the potential future. It's something like that as well, that if we just got our act together and beautified things, that's the place that we can inhabit, and that would ennoble us. And that's why this Jerusalem, the heavenly city, is paved with gemstones. They're crystalline, they emit light, and yeah, it's the proper dwelling place for an enlightened consciousness. Beauty is the proper dwelling place for an enlightened consciousness. And we ignore it at our spiritual and economic peril. It's obvious that beauty, there's almost nothing more valuable than beauty. Economically, practically, right? So, yeah. Why that is, I mean, I don't, it's very, who knows? I mean, why we experience gemstones, for example, is beautiful. It's very mysterious, but there are deep reasons for it. So, yeah.
Hi. I have a bit of a similar question, actually. I know one of the ways in which the Bible is appreciated, even by some of its harshest critics and deeply atheistic people, is as a work of literature, and is something, at least the King James or the authorized translation of the Bible, is something very aesthetically beautiful and a great work of literature and a great work of poetry. And I'm wondering, just from your study of it and from your personal perspective, if there's any particular passages or parts of it that you find particularly have struck you in that way, or that you cherish more than any others that you'd be able to share? Or?
Well, the ones that have really opened up to me, I think, are the stories in Genesis, right up to the Tower of Babel, because I think, well, and hopefully I'll be able to talk to all of you about that, but I think I've got some sense of what they mean and why. I mean, I know it's not exhaustive, and obviously, but and then the story in Exodus as well, I also feel that I've got a handle on that, and so those have hit me really, really hard. And that, I mean, just trying to understand this first part of Genesis, to try to understand what these concepts mean, has been, especially when I started to understand that the concept that human beings are made in God's image, that God has all those attributes that we just described, that human beings are made in God's image, that's actually the cornerstone of our legal system. That really rattled me, because I didn't understand that clearly, that our body of laws has that metaphysical presupposition without which the laws fall apart. And that's starting to happen. It really is, like the postmodern critique of law. The law schools are, I would say, they're overrun by postmodernists who are undermining the structure of Western law as fast as they possibly can, because they don't buy any of this. And so they're much more likely to just think of the law as something like a casual, pragmatic tool to be manipulated for the purposes of bringing forth the utopia. It's a really, really, really bad idea. So it's very strange to me that we go off track when that metaphysical foundation starts to get rattled. And so
do you think your appreciation of the aesthetic beauty of it comes from a belief in like the truth of the underlying propositions? I mean, it's because like even the atheistic critics I'm thinking of, like even Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens, really appreciate the Bible as just a piece of really beautiful literature, and I guess the quality of the writing and the sort of exalted themes behind it, even if they totally reject the underlying premises of it. But you seem to
I don't think that you can see it as beautiful and poetic and reject the underlying premises, because if you see it as beautiful and poetic, you're accepting the underlying premises with your experience of the beauty and the poetics, even though you may be fighting it with your articulated rationality. So I think all that indicates is a disintegrated perspective on the book. And it's not surprising that that's the case. I mean, it's the perspective that everyone has on the book, except with them it's more well-developed and well thought through. But I think it's fundamentally, they're not approaching the thing with enough respect. That's my sense, is that, and who knows, right? Because I don't know, but what I've tried to do is to think, there's probably more to this than I know. And then try to understand it from that perspective, rather than to think, for example, well, it's a collection of superstitions that we've somehow outgrown. It's like, no, it's just, sorry, that's not a deep enough analysis. Because it's got some truth, but it doesn't take into account the fact that the propositions still stand at the foundation of our culture. It doesn't address Nietzsche's central concern, which is that if you blow out the notion of God, the entire structure crumbles. And you can debate that, fine. But I'd just assume that you debated it with Nietzsche, because he's a pretty tough customer to tangle with. So, and I don't think the atheist types, insofar as there's a type, I don't think they've wrestled with the real problems. So, yeah.
So I appreciate you set out some ground rules, keep things rational, and I think that's going to help us. What I'm wondering is, so for instance, you had said elsewhere, the New Testament, from what you can see, it's psychologically correct, and that's quite astounding, I would say. There's a lot of truth, and in your depictions of these stories elsewhere, you've pointed out like deep truths, real powerful. So what my question would be is, if we can say Nietzsche took an order of magnitude of intelligence and depth to be able to predict what would happen in the next century, rationally, if the Bible's not the inerrant word of God, what's going on?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. I mean, I'm going to try to answer that rationally. And as we move forward, but as I said, I don't want to leave people with the notion, because in some ways, this is something I've thought about. What I've been thinking about for a long time is I can't tell if I'm like an advocate of the religious viewpoint or its worst possible critic, because I am doing my best to make it rational, and there's a reductionistic element to that. But I think that I'm doing that while also leaving the door open to things that I don't understand, because I know that there's more to this story than I understand or can understand. And I'm laying out what I can understand, and I'm making it rational. But I do not believe for an instant that exhausts the realm. It's like there are ways of interpreting these stories that work in the conceptual universe we inhabit right now. But there's a lot of things that we don't understand. And one thing I've found about digging into these stories is that the deeper you dig, the more you find. And that's that's one of the things that convinced me that there was more to them than I had originally suspected, because things would click and I'd think, wow, that's really something. And then I would take it apart further and I'd think, oh, well, I thought that was something, but this is even more remarkable. It just keeps opening and opening. And so I'm going to make it rational. I'm going to try to provide an answer to, and it is, I think you're right about speaking about Nietzsche and his capacity for prophecy, and Dostoevsky's in the same category. It's like, there are prophetic elements to the Old and New Testament that seem to stretch over much vaster spans of time. And I'm going to try to produce a rational account of that. But I mean, one of the reasons that I think the New Testament is psychologically true, let's say, is because, and this is one of the things that's deeply embedded in the structure of the Bible. In the Old Testament, there's this idea, and I'm skipping ahead, that through a succession of states, the people who behave properly will eventually establish the proper state. And so the state is viewed in some sense as the entity of salvation. But what happens in the New Testament is that idea gets, you could say, deconstructed. And instead of a state being the place of redemption, a state of being becomes the state of redemption. And so the idea that human beings will be redeemed moves from the utopian state vision to the responsibility of the individual. And I think that's correct. I mean, I believe that that's the right answer. And I think that the West in particular is predicated on that idea because it makes the state subservient to the individual. I mean, there's a what? A dialogue, a continual dialogue, but in the final analysis, the locus of the divine is the individual, not the state. And I believe that that's so true that if we don't act it out and believe it, then we all die painfully. And that's true enough for me. So, yeah.
Thank you for illuminating talk. I'm going to keep you on the creation story, and if you don't mind, because we know this editing that was done, there was the purpose for the editing. Can you give us your thoughts about the difference in the story of creation, especially pertaining to man, from the first chapter, which is very godlike, you know, by a word, and to the second one, which is more like a fatherly type of creation? Is it the selling point? What was the reason for this type of editing to put the two together, one after the other?
Well, I think, you know, the more cynical, what you call criticisms of the Bible and the religious tradition, criticisms like Marx's or Freud's even for that matter, make the case that it's a manifestation of power in politics. And that there's always a political or economic motivation behind the construction of the stories. And I think that that's true to some degree. But I don't think that it's true enough so that you can take that particular interpretive tack and be done with it. And I would say that to the degree that there are political and economic motivations that have shaped the stories, the fact that multiple stories have come together, they're sort of corrective in some sense. And so even if at the level of detail, there's political intrigue and politics, say with regards to the ascendancy of Israel, when you step away from it, it becomes something that's more universal and escapes from that. And how that happened, I don't know. I mean, I think it's safe to say, it's reasonably safe to say that the people who put this document together, they did two things. I think they were guided by their aesthetic taste and their conscience. I truly believe that. And the reason I believe that is because I think anything that was propagandistic would have been forgotten. Because you can't remember propaganda. No one likes it. It's like it's dead 10 years after you write it, or 20 years. And it isn't only that these books were assembled and written, it was that they were preserved and remembered. And to me, that means they have an affinity with the structure of memory. I mean, you think about it. How does a story last 10,000 years unless it's the kind of story you can remember? It doesn't. Because you forget all the forgettable stuff, and all you remember is the memorable stuff. And so there's this interplay between the document itself and its audience that shapes the document. And so, now I don't know how specifically I answered your question. We're going to hit these different stories as they come up in sequence, and I think I'll shed some more light on the relationship between them doing that. And we'll start with that next week. Okay.
Right, so I've been really interested in a lot of the stuff that you've been saying about dreams, because I've been lucid dreaming a lot for many years, but always in a sort of atheistic way, as sort of like a game or something like that. But because of seeing your talks and everything, I've started to think of it from a different perspective, like you're now interfacing with something beyond the narrow scope of your conscious awareness, that, or something like that, maybe mythological or maybe something like God. And so what I've been thinking about, and what I maybe wondered what you think about it, is that in some ways when you're lucid dreaming, you're kind of you're getting beyond the limitations of an ordinary dream. You're sort of transcending limitations, which maybe is Like it's not the purpose of people, right? It's because as a person you're supposed to be limited in some way as opposed to like God who's like not limited. And how, but on the other hand, it's a good opportunity to kind of have control over your interactions with this like very special and like interesting thing. So I guess the conundrum is that on one hand, like you can control your interactions, but on the other hand, like you are controlling them. So I guess I'm wondering what you think about that, and also just in general, what do you think about lucid dreaming as a thing? Like, should you do it, or?
I had a client who could really lucid dream, you know, and one of the things, she used them now and then to solve problems, even though she didn't always pay attention to the answer. But sometimes she did. In one of her dreams, one of the characters told her that she would have to learn to live in a slaughterhouse. She was very afraid of life. And one of the consequences of that was that we went and watched an embalming. So the dreams were, but one of the things she did, she'd ask the characters what they were up to. You know, she was, instead of controlling, she would inquire. And so, but I don't know what to say about lucid dreaming beyond that. Like, I know it's a well-documented phenomena, and many people can do it, and women seem to be able to do it better than men. That's what the research indicates. But I think that what we don't know about lucid dreaming could fill a lot of books. So I think you do. There is some danger in controlling it, I think, because you lose the spontaneous revelation, although not completely, because you can't control it completely. But you see, you might be interested in reading Jung's works on active imagination, because he kind of learned to dream when he was awake. And he spent a lot of time in the world of imagination when he was awake. The Red Books, for example. The Red Book is a document of his experiences with awake dreaming. But he was very interactive with the dream, you know, instead of trying to bend it to his whim or his will. He was exploring it in some sense like you'd explore a video game, you know, which are forms of dreams in and of themselves. So, yeah, I would say do it with an exploratory purpose in mind. And you could always ask yourself what you could learn too, which is a very dangerous question to ask a dream, because sometimes you'll find out what you have to learn. That's not so pleasant, but it's really worthwhile. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I think I'm going to take 4 more questions only, because I'm running out of brain, and I don't want to say stupid things, or stupider things than I've already said. So.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. In the beginning of your lecture, you talked about how society needed this kind of dreamlike religious base so we don't go between left and right violently, and we can kind of have this base. And then you also said you admired Nietzsche for kind of chopping down these ideological and kind of dogmatic weeds coming up from the base of Christianity. I was wondering what your thoughts are on how society can have this kind of religious base without having these kind of dangerous ideologies that can spring up once in a while.
That's what I'm trying to figure out. No, really, I mean, that's the serious answer to that question. You know, I mean, the reason that I'm an admirer of Nietzsche is because he was the spirit of his times. That's a good way of thinking about it. It's not like Nietzsche killed God. It's that Nietzsche gathered what was in the air and articulated it, right, incredibly profoundly. And so he put his finger on the spot. And in doing so, he announced the problem. And once you announce the problem, then maybe you can come up with a solution, because you can't solve a problem unless you know what it is. And the fact that he made it so stark and so clear was horrifying in some sense, but at least we know where we stand. And so since then, and I would say particularly in many ways, particularly with the work of Jung and everything that's come out of that, which is a deeper study of mythology and its meanings, you know, we've been trying to address the issue that Nietzsche brought up and trying to solve the problem. And the problem is something like the reunification of the spirit of mankind. It's something like that. Well, we're slogging through it, man, and that's why you're all here, at least in part. So we'll see how far we can get. I mean, at this rate, we'll get to like the 12th verse in the first. But that's the aim, you know. Okay. Yes, they'll be in the video. I could also make them available as slides. Yeah, well, that's okay. I'll return to this when we get going again. So.
Also, the image of the hyperlink, do the colors have any significance?
Yeah, different colors represent the distance between the cross references. Yeah.
Is the Holy Spirit the same as the Logos?
Well, I'll talk about that more next time. I mean, I think that the best answer to that is I'll talk more about that next time. I mean, I think of them as overlapping metaphorical domains. You know, in the descriptions I put of the fatherly aspect, the son aspect, and the spirit aspect, you could swap a lot of those. You know, it's kind of arbitrary, but I think the Trinitarian idea is trying to get forward the notion that the locus of the divine it's the same thing in its essence, but it exists in a multiplicity. It exists as the spirit of tradition. It exists as the living individual in time and space, and then it exists as the spirit and as consciousness, something like that we all share. Which you know, Jung would have thought about that as something like the capacity for the individual to realize the tragedy and redemption of Christ in their individual life. And that's something like your capacity to voluntarily accept the tragic conditions of your existence and to move forward to something resembling paradise regardless of that. You know, as something that's intrinsic to you. And I think that's associated with the idea of the Pentecost and the Holy Spirit, all of that. So that's as good as I can do in a short period of time. So, yeah. I think it's because of the gap between what we articulate and what we don't know. Something has to fill that gap. Like I think the law could replace it if the law was total, but it isn't. It's bounded and incorrect, and there's something, it has to rest on something inside that's like this mediator between what we articulate and what we don't understand. It's something like custom, it's something like expectation. It's something like the intrinsic sense of justice, you know, that the law itself is aiming at. And those aren't fully articulated, but without them there'd be no grounding. Like, without the body, the law would be a dictionary. You know, and if you don't know what a word means, using the dictionary is helpful, but not that helpful, because, like, unless you've had the experience of anger, the dictionary can't tell you what anger means. It just refers to other words. But the words themselves refer to something else, and the law refers to something else. And without that, it has to be in tune with that something else, and has to be in accordance with it. And so I don't think we can ever delineate the proper body of laws, and that's also why like ideological utopias, see, the ideological utopias dispense with the transcendent. They say, this is what we need to do. It's like, no, you don't know. That's not good. You have to leave space for what you kind of know and for what you don't know. And I mean, you know, in the story of the Tower of Babel, human beings make this massive building that's supposed to reach up to the heavens so that it'll take the place of God. Well, that's the earliest warning we have of the danger of making things so big that you confuse them with God. And God gets irritated and comes down and makes everybody speak different languages and scatters them. It's like, well, that's what happens when you try to make something a totality, is that it starts to fragment inside and disintegrates into catastrophe. And so it's almost as if we have to maintain this articulated space inside the dream, inside the custom, something like that, because otherwise it doesn't work. And I think that's the same as having respect for the fact that we have bodies. You know, we're not just abstract creatures that follow rules. We're not that at all. We only follow certain rules. We won't follow the other ones, and our societies will crumble. And so, we just don't know enough to articulate the entire landscape of behavior with articulated rules. Not at all. We can't do it. It's beyond us. Yeah, yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My question is also about dreams. You spoke about dreams as like a representation of truths and universal truths that can be interpreted into like myths and religion. And as you say, it's very beneficial for the individual, and it sounds like also for the society as well, because not everyone can as easily remember their dreams or interpret their dreams like that. And also it's like broadcasted to all of society for their benefit. So I guess I'm wondering what the evolutionary advantage of dreams are, and my question would be, do you think that dreams suggest some sort of evolutionary group selection, such that like groups that don't have these dreams that are represented into myths and religion, do you think they didn't survive as well?
Okay, so I'm not going to answer the second part of that question because I'd have to go too far off at a tangent for me to manage right now, but I can answer the first part. I mean, what happens when you're dreaming, there's a little switch, so to speak, in your brain that shuts off when you're dreaming, and it stops you from moving, right? It shuts everything off except your eyes, because if you're moving your eyes back and forth, you're not going to run around and get eaten by a lion. It's okay to move your eyes. But the rest of you is staying exactly where it is. Then you can run these simulations. And so what's happening at night, and this is a fairly well accepted theory of dreaming. We know that dreams update memories and help consolidate memories. They also help you forget. But what seems to be happening at night is that you're running the underlying architecture of your cognitive ability in different simulations. And it's cost-free because you're paralyzed. You're not running around there out in the world investigating. So it's part of the manner in which your brain experiments with the way the world can be represented. And so, and it seems absolutely necessary. And I mean, if you deprive people of REM sleep, they don't stay sane very long. There's something necessary about the dreaming process to maintenance of articulated sanity. So you're doing some kind of organization at night when you descend into that chaos. And partly what seems to happen is that your categorical, your categories have boundaries, right? But sometimes you don't have the categories correct. And so the boundaries have to loosen and other things need to be put in the categories or some things shunted away. And in the dream, the category structure loosens, which is why dreams are so peculiar. But they're experimenting. It's your mind is experimenting with the underlying categorical structure of imagination and trying to update your mode of being in the world. Dreams often concentrate on things that provoke anxiety. So if you wake people up when they're dreaming, the most commonly reported emotion is anxiety. And so the dream is like the first stages of the attempt to contend with the unknown. And so the dream is half unknown and half known, which is also why it's so peculiar, because you kind of understand it, but you don't really. And it partakes of the unknown and of the known. And it's the bridge between the two, something like that. So.
Okay, so my question is kind of two parts. The first one is just like a general question and then just the application of the question. So my first question is, do you think that consciousness and beinghood are inextricably linked? And then secondly, so if there was something like a supercomputer that one could house theoretically a perfect brain of a person in it, does that thing then become the same person as the person who was before? So is there a transcendency to beinghood but not to conscious?
Okay, so the first question is, well, I would say that the kind of being that these stories are concerned with is absolutely dependent on consciousness. Now, whether or not that means that being as such is dependent on consciousness actually depends on how you define being. Right? So it's always tricky when you ask, an if is an example of be. Those are tricky questions because it depends on how you define the two. But for our purposes, the being that we're discussing that's represented in these stories is intrinsically associated with conscious experience. And consciousness is given this constitutive role. It says that the experience that we're talking about would not exist if consciousness did not exist. So you can think about it as a kind of game in a way, and then you have to decide for yourself whether that's a game that can be generalized. And I won't answer the second part, okay? If you don't mind. All right.
So, two-part question. First one's very quick, almost admin. If we want to read the biblical stories that kind of you're referring to, is there a particular version, edition, source, publisher that we should refer to?
Oh, I'll bring the thing I like next week, which is I think the Reader's Digest published it of all things, but it's it lays out the narratives in a different format. It's easier. I find it much easier to read. So I'll show it to you, and I'll bring it next time and show it to you.
And then the main question is, one of the main reasons why I'm interested in so much of your work, and I think many people other are as well, is that you kind of leave literalism at the door and you open up another door to a much more deeper meaning. In your interview with Transliminal Media, you mentioned Liz Eibel's book, The Serpent, the Tree, the Serpent, and Vision. And you note that we as a species are very good at recognizing camouflage patterns of snakes, particularly in the lower field of vision. And you further note that visual acuity is correlated with that, and that it co-evolved. And you summarize thusly by saying the following, and I'm paraphrasing you. You say, what gives you vision? Snakes do. That's what it says in Genesis. What else gives you vision? Fruit. That's also right. That's why we have color vision. What makes you self-conscious if you're a man? Woman. That's Eve. And so I understand at the elementary level some of the concepts that you have about representations, dreams, abstractions, etc. But kind of raises the question for me, you know, I'm not accusing you of any creationism or literalism.
Yeah.
You know, what's your point? Why did you make that connection? What's the meaning of the story of Genesis vis-a-vis Liz Eibel's book?
No problem. We're gonna, as soon as I get past this first Genesis 1, we're gonna hit that hard. So. Well, partly.
And are you at all suggesting that one foreshadowed, the discovery, the scientific discovery?
Yes, I'm suggesting that it foreshadowed it. And I think they're the same thing. I mean, Isbell in her books plays with that idea metaphorically, but she never really takes it seriously, which is no problem. I mean, there's only so much you can take seriously, and she did a fine job of what she did. But I'll talk about that a lot, because it's a very complicated issue. I mean, I would say to begin with that the systems that you use to deal with radical uncertainty are the same systems that your primate ancestors evolved to deal with snakes. That's a good start. So, okay? Okay, one more, and then we're done.
Good morning. I'm an aerospace science engineer and an expert computer programmer, and I have 3 rapid-fire questions, so I'm going to get through them quick. Based on your opinion of where the universities now stand in terms of humanities and social sciences, is mathematics more powerful than articulated speech?
I'm not sure, I'm not exactly sure how the first...
Does it make you more powerful to study mathematics and art science in universities?
Oh, well, it depends on what you mean by power, I guess. I mean, obviously studying mathematics and computer science makes you insanely powerful. The question is, to what end? And I don't think that you can extract an answer to that from the study of mathematics. The humanities are there to ground people in proper citizenhood. That's a way of thinking about it. And so, yes, it makes you powerful, but then the question is, who has the power? Because it might not be you. It might be the mathematics, so to speak. You know, because you never know what you're an agent of, precisely. And so, yeah, well, look, I've got nothing against computer programmers. I mean, more power to you guys, and mathematicians as well. But
mathematics would be a tool, not
yes, and it has to be a tool. Right, it has to be a tool of something. And what the humanities were for was to tell people what the tools should be used for. And so the tools themselves are crazily powerful. But that's not necessarily, an untrammeled good. So I have to stop because...
One more, about art.
Okay, quick.
You love art. I know you love
art.
I want to answer this question. All right?
Okay.
Okay, you were in this, I guess, one room in a museum in New York where
Yeah.
you'd seen some original Renaissance artwork masterpieces.
Yeah.
Like, these are generally accepted as amazing artifacts, okay? Does an original work of art, as opposed to a high-fidelity reproduction, contain the spirit of the artist who created it, and does this account for the disparity in how much you'd have to pay for an original?
It does in part. I knew a good portrait artist, and one of the things he pointed out about a great portrait is that it actually contains time. So, because a photograph is one instant, but a portrait is you layered on you, layered on you. So it's got a thickness, and I think you can see that thickness in the original, but it's also a direct manifestation of that creative act of perception. And I don't think you get that You just can't get the fidelity of the original with the reproduction. But there's more to it than that too, because the painting doesn't end with the frame. You know, like we tend to think of the painting itself as the object, but most objects are densely innervated with historical context. And you can say, well, the historical context isn't the object, but it depends on what you mean by the object. And often people, when they buy a piece of a painting, are buying the historical context, and you just don't get that with the reproduction. It's a kind of magic. It's like, do you want to have Elvis Presley's guitar or another guitar just like it? Well, you want to have Elvis's guitar. It's why. You can't tell it's Elvis's guitar by looking at it.
Yeah, but why would you want it? Was there any rational reason for wanting the original? I mean, it's exactly the same. It's a perfect fidelity reproduction, if there's such a thing.
Well, it is at the level of detail, but not at the level of context. That's how it looks to me. Okay, we got to go. Thank you.